with this. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Will Moyer. I'm one of the course directors for the NINDS Clinical Trials Methodology course. The purpose of this session is to allow people who are considering applying for the course to have questions answered in real time from us. We don't have a set agenda. If there is a paucity of questions, I think we can go through some of the recurring themes that we've seen in past years with the application process. But at this time, I will let our our, our course project manager introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Joy, and I'm the project manager for the course. And you've probably all received emails from me. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me as well.
And I will have the other course directors introduce themselves in alphabetical order, noting that Dr. Lewis isn't going to be with us today.
So I guess that makes me first.
Yep.
Last name. Yep. So I'm Chris Coffey. I'm a professor of biostatistics at the University of Iowa and one of the course directors.
Hi, I'm Robin Conway. I'm a neurologist in the Division of Clinical Research and one of the course directors.
Hi, I'm Lori Gutman. I'm a neurologist, chair of neurology at Indiana University. I'm one of the course directors.
All right. So with that, I think if any of the attendees have questions about their projects or their applications, the floor is now open. You can either use the Q&A function or click on raise your hand, and then we'll let you use audio if your audio is connected. And you could also potentially put it in the chat box. We'll look in all of those. We'll look in all of those places. I think while we're waiting to see those sorts of questions, I think probably something that is of relatively high yield is to go through some of the things that we see as frequently recurring themes that give us less enthusiasm for applications as we go through the process. This is, one thing that I think is very helpful is to look at our website and look at the frequently asked questions. One of these is number 7, the application common pitfalls. Several of these are too ambitious of a study in scale or translation of science. Our goal is to help with early phase trials that could help lead to those larger, more ambitious trials. Every disease is different and has its own unique challenges in terms of whether multi-center trials are needed because it's so rare, or it's very difficult to reach populations or enrolled populations like acute stroke, where it requires a lot of infrastructure to see those patients. Other application common pitfalls are underpowered efficacy studies, where trying to find a effect in a small group in order to generate enthusiasm for a larger study, which again, we work on moving our trainees to alternative approaches to look at different questions in the early phase space. Another pitfall is whether or not you have access to the drug or technology to be utilized. Sometimes there's promising agents that are under study for different conditions, but aren't yet approved. So having buy-in from the manufacturer or owner of those technologies or molecules prior to applying for the course is helpful. Otherwise, you may be designing a trial that you can't get the requisite materials to do. A common thing that comes up is just knowing about how to do clinical trials that end up being funded through NINDS. A key issue is that there aren't pilot or small sample size grants for clinical trials at NINDS, the R21 mechanism is not allowed for clinical trials. At other institutes, it may be, but at NINDS, there's not been a successful track record getting clinical trials, even smaller ones, done with that sort of scale of resources. So that's not an option. There are also interesting aspects of what is eligible for clinical trials through K23 grants. Definitely more of a focus on mechanistic studies, learning about why treatments work is within the instructions at NINDS important, as opposed to sort of later phase 2. So that means that a lot of clinical trials at NINDS are going to be R01 or U01 phase grants. So a lot of what our goal is to set you up to do a study that can get you the preliminary data to be competitive for one of those. So there's a lot of focus potentially on other mechanisms, whether it's foundations or CTSAs. So those are important considerations. The people sometimes want to put in a lot more references than there's space for, and we do have our page limits for a reason. Mainly, clarity of thought in terms of getting your ideas across. So, respect for the page limits is appreciated. We don't necessarily administratively withdraw them if they go a little over, but it certainly doesn't put us in a good mood sometimes. But again, certainly check in with us, and people can do relatively novel things with references to limit their space but allow them to be useful. There's a nice tutorial, and we've had a webinar on pilot and feasibility studies. So thinking about what are answerable questions that are important for you to learn about whether you should do the next phase of the study. So that's so those are some things that I think come up as recurring themes. Obviously, part of our course is to help you refine that idea. So, but a lot of it is making sure you're sort of in the right ballpark to progress through our curriculum. And commonly, and some of the reasons that we have some of these as preferences is we've just seen over the years what sorts of projects we can help you complete the idea and get submitted and or funded versus projects that are a little bit of a heavier lift. So I think that's I think a decent amount. So did any of the other course directors have anything they wanted to add there?
I'll add, I mean, you alluded to it. It's really the Goldilocks approach, right? It can't be too small that there's no structure. You're not really answering anything. And it can't really be too big. If it's going to take 10, 15 sites across the US, it's probably too big of a lift. So.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that you didn't touch on was that it really needs to be your project. And I think that's very important, that sometimes we want this to be something that you have ownership over, so that you can modify the trial as we go along, based on what you see is appropriate, and not necessarily have it be someone else's trial that you're just trying to learn from, right? Or that you don't have any control over. So if you learn something in the course and you think, oh, maybe I need to do this a little bit differently, if it's not your study, you obviously can't do that. Also, you don't want it to be something that you've already started, which has happened in the past before. When someone comes in with a study design based on something that they've already started, well, then it's too late to kind of try to change the design. The goal is to give you a usable product at the end, if that's a way to put it. You want, at the end of this course, you want to have something that you can take forward, not just the knowledge from the course, which you will gain, but also something that could, I don't know, a product just kind of makes it sound weird, but I think that's the way I think about it, that there's some tangible thing that you take away from the course.
This is Robin Conwit from NINDS. I really want to emphasize that the rigor of the preclinical data has to be such that you've done a thorough literature review, no one else is doing the exact same thing, and that, you know, as Lori said, you have ownership over the idea. That's super important.
Yeah, that's a common thing. If we have concerns that you wouldn't be the scientific leader of the project, we then that's not something that would be a good fit for the course, and we look at that as in a very sort of discrete way of, would you be the first author of the paper that comes out from this study? Would you be the person who's at the top of the, you know, is the PI submitting the IRB? So those are important, like absolute sort of guiding principles, in that we want to make sure that this is moving your career development forward. And those are very good points from Dr. Conwit. Different diseases have different sort of preclinical models. Again, not all types of projects in the course do have a requisite animal model, but there needs to be, if it's a behavioral intervention, there needs to be the relevant theory. We have some instructions on that in the application. And I think the other point is, it is very important to make sure through some degree of searching through clinicaltrials.gov and the NIH project reporter, to get a sense as to if somebody is already working on this sort of project, because that can be it can be concerning, and it can lead to your question sort of being answered before you get the opportunity to start. So we don't want you to spend a lot of time designing something when the answers you may get from it are not going to be are already going to be kind of out there in the literature. I think another question that comes up sometimes is, people are in a point of transition across institutions. We often are a bit worried about that, because there's a lot that one has to do professionally and personally, particularly if they're moving to a new city as they move, and it can be a little difficult to make progress if there is that sort of switch in between. The course involves a lot of pre-work in terms of meeting with your small groups before the intensive experience. And then this year we're going to have the intensive experience be remote, but still, sort of 2 to 3 days where there's the expectation that a lot of progress and work is getting done on your protocols. So that's, if you're trying to do a move from one institution to the other and all that onboarding and everything like that, that can really sort of slow down your progress and attention towards your study design. So that's important that's why we want to know, and that's why it may not be a good fit. It's not an absolute rule, and sometimes people have a very clear progression as to how they're moving to a new institution, but it needs to be pretty well annotated from the chair or supervisor at the next institution as to what exactly is going to facilitate that potential success. And again, you may want to talk to us if you're in that situation, since we can sort of give you more advice as to how to potentially make this work through that transition.
Well, the thing I would add to that is the thing that could be even more problematic with the move that would have to be addressed even more is if what you're proposing to do uses some specialized piece of equipment that may be at your current institution but not at an institution you might move towards, or whether like the expertise to mentor you and your project is available at your current institution but might not be at your new institution, because those raise issues of feasibility and whether there would be the senior mentors to help you along. So that those would be beyond the general concerns that Will mentioned that would need to be addressed in the proposal.
I think, I would be sort of interested from the attendees, what sort of disease areas you're working in, if you want to put those in the chat, because I think it's also always interesting to see where we may go. One of the course philosophies is that you will be working with a biostatistician and a clinician who are facile in the conduct and design of neurologically based trials, but they may not be exactly a subspecialist in your area, and that's a feature, not a bug. But we do work with the other faculty to try to bounce things off of them to keep that expertise open. But similar to an NIH review panel, it is very likely that there are going to be other types of specialists and subspecialists who are either both reviewing your grant and also on the panel voting about the score of your grant. So the being able to explain science from across disciplines is important. So we got a couple from epilepsy, a couple a neuromodulation, which we've had. We've got myopathies. The neuromuscular course one of the neuromuscular course directors smiles at the myopathies, focal seizures.
Missed SMA too.
Oh yeah, SMA. All right. So again, if there's anybody out there who has more specific questions, feel free to raise your hand, type them in the box. Trying to think of other things that are. So yeah, that's a good question. A study focused on older adults with interest in studying the mechanisms of underlying age-related cognitive decline. So we do, we're a clinical trials course, so the mechanisms of decline purely, if they aren't sort of couched pretty closely to some form of a intervention, something that's going to change the trajectory of that decline, typically aren't a good focus for the course. Sometimes we've had sort of biomarker-based studies that are being set up so as to develop late phase biomarkers and have them work. And biomarkers could represent imaging, serum, et cetera, but that they would be working closely with the development of a companion therapeutic. So we do, it is a clinical trial design course. There may be very good clinical research questions, clinical epidemiology, natural history questions that need to be answered. But typically without an intervention of some sort or some very close linkage to an intervention that would be pursued, it's generally not a good fit for this course. Not to say that it might not be the best thing to do scientifically right now, but our course is setting up trials that are interventional and that patients are getting some treatments or some new thing, some behavioral intervention, some device, some drug, some exercise, some new diet. There is some movement towards testing something as opposed to observing the progression of a disease.
So physical exercise could be an intervention, but it can be a difficult one to. We certainly have had studies in the course that used exercise intervention, but it can be tough, as Robin said. It's not impossible, but definitely exercise is medicine. So
the challenges with exercise are you can end up what exactly is the dose, or
right.
How is exercise defined, and that would have to be pretty clear.
Although now that with the pandemic, everybody has ordered Pelotons. You can just measure the wattage, and then you can get the the dosage as to how many watts you generate each day.
Not everybody's ordered Pelotons.
I know it's like I live in a strange strange bubble here in Ann Arbor. I know that not everybody has a Peloton. The other, I think the other thing about exercise interventions is that historically exercise is great. It reduces many medical problems and improves outcomes on a variety of dimensions. But it can be a tough sell in terms of grants at NIH and NINDS because of the challenges in generalizing it to the population. It is great. We've known that the exercise is great for a lot of things for a while, and we haven't come up with great ways to get people exercising. So particularly if it is something focused on improving adherence with exercise, that those sorts of things maybe are at a stage where that might be more useful. But again, certainly that exercise often has good preclinical data. We're not we are open to all ideas. We certainly have oomph on our faculty with respect to non-pharmacologic interventions. So but the dose and schedule can be a little tricky to figure out, and how you measure that and adherence can be big issues there. Other questions about some of the.
I was going to comment a little bit on, I noticed one person at least mentioned deep brain stimulation as an area of interest. That's another one that we've had many proposals, but one of the challenges with those is often there's a lot of different ways for an intervention to make adjustments here or there. It's similar, the dose becomes a concern. So it's really important, I think, if you're submitting a proposal like with DBS, of what exactly your intervention is versus your control, because defining the dose has proven somewhat problematic with some in the past.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to note, in that, and I think we haven't necessarily gotten. There are a lot of potential ways to approach that problem, but a lot of times there's so much tweaking that is done in just the general clinical space in terms of the tuning you have with an individual, and how much of that is, I guess, based on experience versus the biology of how the DBS is working. That there's a class of designs called N of 1 experiments, and we did have a couple of projects that have gone there, and sort of you can meta-analyze these N of 1 experiments, where there's just sort of a particularly for chronic diseases, a set of progressions as to how each individual could learn about what settings work the best for them. So there's definite potential, but there's also often the more I guess traditional or sort of usual large trial designs often aren't as applicable. It's not to say that there aren't things we can work with there, but it's got to be they're sort of special with special types of sort of considerations.
As far as the mentorship question goes, you should work with the mentors. You should work with the mentors that are right for your project and for you. So yeah, current mentors are fine. No, you don't have to start fresh. It's actually maybe better not to start fresh unless it's a fresh new idea. You just want, yeah, current mentors are fine. Says Robin.
With the caveat that Will mentioned earlier, which is worth reiterating, that it can't be the mentor's project. It has to be your project with the mentor serving the mentor role.
And having an engaged mentor can be can be crucial. And I think there's sort of two things that and sometimes this person can have, both of those things, but sometimes they're sort of different people. But one is somebody who's experienced in enrolling in clinical trials at your institution, I think is important. And then somebody who has scientific expertise in this area. And sometimes those people could be different because the scientific expert may have more of a preclinical background. And that's okay. It's really good to get those sorts of people together. And the mentor who's more engaged in upfront sort of recruitment and retention at your institution, could be in a more or less, auxiliary role. But I think crucial to have them as part of the team, just so that you don't have to go through all the nuts and bolts of where you can find clinic space to see people and all those sorts of things, to have us have some evidence that a lot of those sort of high level logistical things, you have somebody who you can tap for help with that.
Do people have questions that are, other people have questions that are specific to their projects? We can get pretty granular in these sessions if you really want to get granular.
Yeah, and again, I think if you've looked through the application packet, something that can be helpful is sending us kind of like the key bullet points of what you're studying, what kind of intervention, what kind of outcome measure you're using. That gives us a good sort of top level, and what sort of general scale of the study. Obviously, part of this is learning how to scale and resource the study is important. But if you have a really variable outcome measure, and it's going to be thousands of patients, it's important then to think about if there's a different type of question that, again, if you're doing a stroke study, you definitely have to collect the modified Rankin score, but something that's more proximate, maybe more studyable in a short-term study, whether it's short-term changes in the NIH stroke scale as being a little bit more of an agile proof of concept type outcome marker that has its own problems. But if you're looking to see changes in top level disability, the outcome measure is a good indicator to us as to what the it's makes it look like this is potentially a underpowered efficacy study. Now, it's not to say it's not important to have some of those as secondary outcomes for your early studies, but to power a sort of 50 patient study on the modified Rankin score is going to be looked at problematically, just because it's hard to discover anything in terms of a change on that sort of scale with that sort of number of patients. Even if you find an online sample size calculator that says you could. I'm trying to think, do we have, I don't know if we have that. So Dr. Conway has asked if we have an example grant posted. Do we have I think, oh, yeah, we do. It's so if you go onto our website and you go to clinical trials resources, there is one of the buttons on the left. There is a link to 2 versions of a grant for an R01 that's currently an ongoing single site trial, although it's now actually in the follow-up phase, and I need to crunch some data from it right now. So we do have. This isn't an example application, but it's a study that's focused on hypertension. Typically, though, if you wanted to do a hypertension trial, we would be not super interested in it because it doesn't meet the sort of neurosciences requirements of the course. Although we've had people come to us with stroke prevention trials, and because stroke prevention requires so many patients, we've told them to change their outcome measure to blood pressure. So, again, it's with a close linkage to cardiovascular disease and stroke, we have it. But it's an example of a single site R01 type trial that I had initially tried to submit under an R34 mechanism. And probably the reason that was a planning mechanism that NHLBI had. But probably the biggest reason that it didn't succeed at the R34 step was there weren't enough resources to actually get the study done in a 2-year smaller scale grant, whereas moving it to a R01 opened up a lot more in the way of resources.
You already answered the question in the Q&A, Will.
Oh, I didn't see that one. Oh, spinal cord. Okay, so the question is there much experience with spinal cord stimulation and translational improvements? I would say we have some, I think we've had one spinal cord stimulator study. And I've worked with our group here in terms of something that was built up for that, for changing perfusion in stroke, although for practicality reasons wasn't really able to enroll. So I think spinal cord stimulation and neurostimulation have some, I think, similar challenges, but I think, again, potentially are a good fit for the course because they can have a lot of impact within a single individual. It can be tricky as to what sort of design to use. And I know that we sort of give advice about these things, but ensuring that the project is within a sort of ballpark that will ultimately allow you to progress and get a usable idea, an end product, so to speak, using Dr. Gutman's term, is sort of why we look into it at the front end. So yeah, I think particularly if you're in those neurostimulation, whether DBS or spinal cord stimulator, sending a early version of your just sort of top level idea, like what outcome you're trying to shift, and even if it's more tolerability, and sort of what the thinking is in terms of the general design and how it affects the disease, could be helpful to ask us early. As we get closer and closer to the deadline, our ability to respond in a way that can actually help you make meaningful improvements to your application definitely goes down. So the sooner you could send something to us to opine on, the more chance there is that we could try to get you some feedback on it.
To expand a little bit on what Will mentioned, I think one of the challenges there is how to come up with an answerable question in the types of studies that we're designing in the course. I think a pretty common concern is something will come in one of those areas that is designed like a large phase 3 and it's just a mini version of it. So it's not solely the design, it really gets to the core is what is your question for your smaller trial, and is it answerable in a way with the design? And so that's something to carefully think about, particularly with some of these challenging disease and intervention areas.
Yeah, like as an example, the study that we couldn't do because it was just too impractical to enroll people in because of the timing of getting the spinal cord stimulator implanted, looked at short-term changes on and off the stimulator in cerebral blood flow. So looking at a proof of concept measurable outcome that we think this spinal cord stimulator is going to exert this biologic effect, and if it does, that sort of is a reason to potentially progress forward to look for changes on clinical outcomes by expanding the amount of perfusion during the recovery period. Again, it's not the greatest example because it's pretty hard to get a spinal cord stimulator into an acute stroke patient, but it was, at least mechanistically, it was looking at something that was measurable along the proposed mechanism of action within a shorter time period. But I think if the question was, can you reduce disability, which would be the ultimate question, That's a harder question to answer without getting, is it improving the blood flow at all, was the question to answer first. And getting to what that right question for your step is can be tricky. So but it's crucial to try to get that question in the right sort of galaxy to start.
I think
All right. Oh, go ahead.
one other thing just to talk about is that this year will be different than in the past. And so we are still hoping to, despite this being a totally virtual, it won't, a lot of what we've done in the past has been virtual, so that won't change. What will change is the in-person course obviously won't be in person, but we hope to be able to compensate for some of the camaraderie and intensity that normally happens during the in-person. So we definitely still want people to apply for this year, and we definitely will still work as hard as we have in the past with everyone to get you to the end product, since now that's become my verbiage for it.
Well, and yeah, and I think the idea that there is a product or project that is going along with this is in contrast to some other types of clinical research courses or other sorts of adult professional development, and that it is really crucial that you have something that you're working on as this goes along. There are certainly other types of courses that can be more sort of passive and theoretical as to what is it that you're working towards. And again, it's also a distinction in that we are working to help you design the clinical trial, the basic experiment. And that, the design of the experiment, so to speak, is a little different from how one would write a grant to convince others to give you resources to do that experiment. So we focus on the experiment and the question first, and then it actually can be, you can think of a lot of issues that you might not think of if you're just making an argument for why something ought to be studied in a more grant-like way. So that's the philosophy of this course, is come up with how the design is going to work, and then the argument, the motivational piece of work, the grant as to how to get the resources to do that and answer that question, we have come as the sort of secondary point after you've really vetted your idea and come up with the pre-planning to set up the trial. All right. Well, I think, oh yeah, so I think that's a really good point. We do recognize that this is a unprecedented disruption of usual types of professional development activities. We certainly are hoping for you to make a lot of progress on your trial designs during this sort of time period that we have sort of laid out from approximately April through November. However, we have found that people have grant resubmissions, additional tweaks to the design that need to occur in response to revisions or requests from the FDA or IRBs. So we are working to sort of ensure that you will have the possibility of attending an in-person experience at some point. Again, probably in concert with the course that we're holding in 2022 in July of that year. So again, stay tuned for that. We want to make sure that you stay engaged if you are selected to be part of the course, but we are going to work to get you to an in-person experience at some point. Even if your trial is a resounding success by the time that's coming around, then we definitely want you to come to share your insights and help with the new people who are developing their trial. If you're still working on tweaking things, we're going to work to set up some form of a parallel track so that you can continue to make some progress if you need to. But we understand that time horizon can be quite long. So it's not necessarily a requirement, but we are working to come up with ways that we can offer to bring you in 2022, so you can continue to add value on this idea and this progression.
Thanks to everybody for your time. If there's no other specific questions.
Yep. No, thank you. And again, don't feel free to kind of give us a quick synopsis of your idea. It doesn't need to be, probably the earlier the better if you have worries, simply so that we can, give you some degree of feedback and direction. But again, also not only earlier in the idea, but also earlier in the year, as we get closer and closer to the deadline, we will have less bandwidth to kind of talk through things. So